The sky split apart in fire. At first, people thought it was another meteor shower, an unusually bright one streaking across the upper atmosphere. But as the trails of flame coalesced into perfect formations, as the heavens themselves seemed to ripple and part, the world fell silent. From New York to Beijing, from the slums of Lagos to the glass towers of Dubai, everyone turned their eyes upward. The ships were vast, each one a floating cathedral of impossible design. Spires of shimmering light stretched skyward, their hulls adorned with glowing runes that pulsed like the heartbeat of a god. They did not land. They did not need to. They simply hovered, casting enormous shadows over the world below. And then the voice came. It was not transmitted by radio waves or broadcast through any known means. It arrived directly in the mind, a resonant, inescapable presence that flooded every human consciousness at once. Kneel, children of dust. The gods have returned. For a moment, the world held its breath. The voice was like nothing ever heard before, ancient and absolute, layered with 1,000 harmonies, carrying the weight of something beyond mortal comprehension. It spoke in every language simultaneously, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The gods, if that was truly what they were, had come to claim their dominion. In the White House Situation Room, President Elias Monroe stared at the grainy satellite images on the screen before him, his knuckles white against the polished wood of the table. His military advisors whispered hurriedly, some insisting on immediate surrender, others urging a desperate counteroffensive. But Monroe, a man who had seen war firsthand, remained silent. His mind churned through every historical precedent, every story of conquest and resistance. And then he looked up at General Kate Holloway, his top military strategist. "They expect us to kneel," he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "What happens when we don't?" Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "We find out how mortal these gods really are." Across the world, similar conversations played out. In underground bunkers, in war rooms, in hidden enclaves where leaders, scientists, and strategists gathered, the same unspoken truth lingered in the air. Surrender meant servitude. Resistance meant annihilation. And yet, even as fear settled like a thick fog over the world, something else stirred beneath it. A defiance, raw and unyielding, as ancient as the species itself. Then, in a small New York apartment, a former Marine named Daniel Graves did something unthinkable. He picked up his sniper rifle, climbed to the roof of his building, and aimed at the divine emissary that had descended into Times Square. The figure hovered above the ruins of the city, its golden armor gleaming under the neon haze of broken billboards. The god was speaking. Daniel pulled the trigger. The first shot rang out. And for the first time in 1,000 years, a god bullet. The bullet struck the divine emissary just above the eye. For a fraction of a second, time itself seemed to hesitate. The celestial being, clad in golden armor, its form half material and half light, jerked backward, a burst of iridescent fluid spraying from its forehead. A sound, something between a shriek and the groaning of a collapsing star, tore through the air. The sniper's shot had not killed it, but it had done something far more important. It had wounded it. And the world was watching. The emissary's golden eyes, burning with incomprehensible fury, locked onto Daniel Graves. The Marine barely had time to move before the air around him crackled and bent, reality itself twisting as an unseen force hurled him off the rooftop. He hit the pavement 3 stories below, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Pain surged through his ribs, but he forced himself to move. He wasn't dead. That meant he still had work to do. All across Earth, the act of defiance sent shockwaves. Footage of the moment, shaky, blurry cell phone recordings, spread like wildfire. A god had bled. A god had been hurt. And if a god could be wounded, then perhaps a god could be killed. The Celestials responded instantly. Above Times Square, the wounded emissary straightened, lifting one clawed hand. Its voice, once calm and omnipotent, was now a thunderous command of pure rage. Defilers, vermin, you will learn your place. The sky ignited. Columns of divine fire rained down upon the city, engulfing entire blocks in golden conflagration. Buildings melted like wax. Cars and people alike were vaporized in an instant. The screams of millions filled the air. What had once been an awe-inspiring demonstration of power turned into a massacre. And yet, amidst the destruction, something unexpected happened. The moment the first fires fell, human defenses activated. Not from orders, not from planning, just instinct. SWAT teams, National Guardsmen, underground resistance cells, and everyday civilians grabbed whatever weapons they had and began to fight. The gods had come, and humanity's first answer was blood and lead. In Washington, the Pentagon's Emergency War Council came to a singular, chilling realization. This isn't a negotiation, General Holloway said, watching the devastation unfold in real time. They're not here to rule us. They're here to burn us. President Monroe exhaled slowly, his hands tightening into fists. His next words would determine the fate of Earth itself. Then let's make them bleed. Across the planet, orders were given. Nuclear silos were unlocked. Stealth bombers scrambled from hidden airfields. Cyber warfare teams launched full-scale attacks against the celestial fleet, probing for weaknesses. Humanity, outgunned and outmatched, had just made its choice. And so, in the ashes of the first battle, the war between gods and mortals truly began. The first wave of human retaliation was pure defiance. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't strategic. It was survival. In the burning streets of New York, soldiers and civilians fired wildly at the towering celestial warriors who descended in golden armor, their bodies wreathed in shimmering energy. Bullets bounced off their radiant shields. Rockets exploded harmlessly against their gleaming forms. The gods walked through the gunfire like it was rain. And yet, amid the chaos, something changed. Daniel Graves, bloodied and barely standing, watched from a ruined alley as a resistance fighter, just a kid, no older than 20, fired a scavenged alien rifle at one of the Celestials. The shot struck the being's shoulder, and instead of deflecting, the golden shield flickered. For half a second, the god stumbled. It wasn't invulnerable. Graves's mind raced. The sniper round he fired earlier had done the same thing. It hadn't been stopped outright. The gods were powerful, but their defenses weren't perfect. And that meant they had weaknesses. Somewhere beneath the earth, in a deep black site research facility, a scientist named Dr. Evelyn Carter stared at a monitor filled with rapidly scrolling data. She and her team had been analyzing every scrap of intelligence on the Celestials since their arrival, running simulations on their energy fields, their physiology, their ships. And now, they had their first breakthrough. Their shields aren't passive, she realized, her voice breathless with shock. They're reactive. General Holloway leaned in, eyes narrowed. Explain. Carter spun her screen around, displaying frame-by-frame footage of Graves's sniper shot and the resistance fighter's energy blast. The Celestial shields absorb energy on impact, but only in the immediate area where they're hit. They don't redistribute it across their bodies. She pulled up a separate image, thermal readings of a downed Celestial ship. It's the same with their vessels. The shields are incredibly strong, but they can't block multiple simultaneous impacts in different places. Holloway's mind clicked into place. So if we hit them in 2 spots at once, they'll break. Carter finished, her eyes gleaming. A plan was already forming. Holloway turned to an officer. Get this intel to every surviving military unit. I want coordinated strikes. Small arms fire to one side, armor-piercing rounds to the other. If we can overwhelm their defenses, we can kill them. And kill them they did. Across the battlefield, soldiers took up new firing patterns. A team of Marines in Los Angeles fired simultaneous bursts at a Celestial warlord. One shot to the chest, another to the leg. The golden barrier flickered, and then, for the first time, shattered. A missile followed, striking the warlord square in the chest. The explosion sent the once immortal being sprawling. A moment later, a dozen rounds pierced its skull. The impossible had happened. The gods were bleeding. And now, they were dying. The first confirmed celestial kill spread like wildfire. Across every surviving military channel, on every resistance frequency, 3 words repeated like a battle cry. They can die. In space, aboard the flagship of the celestial High Sovereign, the gods took notice. The divine council stood in their chamber, a towering cathedral of light and ethereal fire. Holographic projections showed battlefields across Earth, golden warriors, once untouchable, now falling to mortal hands. The High Sovereign, a being of immense, radiant presence, gazed upon the footage in silence. Then, for the first time in over 1,000 years, he clenched his fists. "They do not fear us," he said, his voice rippling across the chamber like the roar of a collapsing sun. "They defy us." One of his warlords, an imposing figure wreathed in blue flame, stepped forward. "They are insignificant, a species of children playing at war. We will drown them in fire." "No," came another voice. It belonged to Solarath, one of the Celestials' most decorated generals. Unlike the others, his gaze was not filled with contempt, but something far more dangerous: calculation. He gestured to the battlefield footage, pausing on images of fallen Celestials. "They learn. They adapt. No species has ever resisted us like this. And if they can kill us, others will follow." A heavy silence filled the chamber. The High Sovereign turned his glowing gaze to Solarath. "And what do you suggest?" The general's answer was immediate. "We escalate. No mercy, no more demands for surrender. We burn their world to ash." The council murmured in agreement, but before the sovereign could speak, another voice cut through the chamber. "They are not like the others." Every celestial turned. The speaker was Nyxara, a lesser-ranked warlord, but one with a reputation for her cunning. She stepped forward, eyes locked on the High Sovereign. "Every species before them fell because they believed they were weak," she continued, "because they knew they were lesser. But humans, they don't believe in their own inferiority. They fight as if they are already our equals. And that makes them dangerous." A murmur of unease passed through the Celestials. Nyxara's gaze sharpened. "If we attempt to break them, we may fail. We must control them another way." The High Sovereign regarded her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he turned away, his robes of living energy flowing around him. "Burn their cities," he ordered. "Crush their armies. Show them despair." Then his voice darkened. "And when they are at their weakest, we make them gods." Back on Earth, humanity had no idea what was coming. As cities burned and celestial forces doubled their assault, a new kind of battle was being prepared. Not just a war of strength, but a war for the very soul of humanity. The second wave came with no warning. Celestial warships, once content to hover like divine monuments, now moved with purpose. The heavens cracked open as entire squadrons descended in coordinated strikes. Plasma lances the size of skyscrapers carved through the earth, turning streets into rivers of molten glass. Millions died in the first hour alone. In orbit, Earth's remaining satellites flickered and died, cut off by an unseen force. Communications collapsed. The world went dark. And yet, humanity did not fall. Deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain, General Holloway watched as her command table filled with reports. Fires in Beijing. Total devastation in London. The fall of Paris. Every major city was under attack. But then, something unexpected. Enemy forces engaging one another over South America. She frowned. Magnify that. The screen zoomed in, showing something impossible. 2 celestial warships, one wreathed in blue fire, the other in golden flame, exchanging blows in high orbit. Holloway's heart pounded. Internal conflict. Her eyes narrowed. Get me anything on this. A lieutenant turned from his console. Ma'am, we're receiving a transmission, but it's not human. Put it through. The voice that came through was deep, alien, and utterly calm. Humans, you are not alone. Holloway's breath caught. Identify yourself. I am Solrath, warlord of the Celestial Dominion, and I have come to make you an offer. Across the planet, in the burning ruins of Washington, D.C., Daniel Graves and his resistance team took shelter in the husk of a collapsed skyscraper. Outside, celestial enforcers moved through the rubble, golden visors scanning for survivors. Graves clenched his rifle, jaw tight. They're not just killing us anymore, he murmured. They're taking people. The reports had been growing. Humans vanishing mid-battle. Those taken never returning. And then there were the broadcasts. Horrific images of captured fighters standing beside Celestials, their eyes glowing with divine light. They're converting us, said Sergeant Riley, his voice grim. Turning people into whatever the hell they are. Graves felt a chill run through him. A fate worse than death. Then his radio crackled to life. All resistance forces, priority message from command. Possible celestial defection. Stand by. Graves exchanged a look with Riley. A defection. From them. It made no sense. The gods did not break. They did not betray their own. And yet, as the war raged on, Solrath's transmission spread across human forces. The message was simple. We underestimated you. I will not make that mistake again. If humanity wishes to survive, we must speak. For the first time since the invasion began, a celestial warlord was offering something besides death. But the question remained, was it a trap? Or was it the first crack in the divine empire? Daniel Graves didn't trust the celestial warlord. Not for a damn second. But as he and his team were escorted through the ruins of Washington, D.C., following the coordinates provided by Solrath, he knew they didn't have much choice. Humanity was losing. Every day, the Celestials burned more cities, took more people, and those taken didn't come back as prisoners. They came back changed, walking alongside the enemy with glowing eyes and voices that no longer belonged to them. Graves gritted his teeth. If this was a trap, they'd die fighting. At the meeting point, deep inside an abandoned underground bunker, the resistance fighters gripped their weapons tightly as a shimmering rift split open before them. From the swirling void stepped Solrath. Unlike the Celestials they had fought, his armor was cracked, his once glorious energy dimmed. Scars lined his glowing skin, wounds that should have been impossible for a god. But most unsettling was his expression. He looked tired. I come alone, Solrath said, his voice resonating through the bunker. If I meant to kill you, you would already be dead. Graves leveled his rifle at the warlord's head. We've heard that before. Solrath sighed. You do not trust me. Good. Your kind's defiance is why we speak at all. General Holloway's voice crackled through Graves' earpiece. Try to get intel. If he makes a move, kill him. Graves hesitated. He'd fought these things, watched them slaughter entire cities. But something in Solrath's stance, his words, felt different. The Celestials' gaze darkened. The High Sovereign has lied to you. We were not always gods. We were once like you, flesh and will, conquerors of the stars. His fingers curled into fists. But we feared death, so we became gods. We abandoned our weakness, made ourselves immortal, and in doing so, we lost something we did not understand. Graves narrowed his eyes. And what's that? Solrath's voice was grave. The ability to fight as you do. To fight like you have nothing to lose. A silence fell over the bunker. Then, Solrath stepped forward. I have seen my kind falter against you. Your soldiers, your pilots, your hackers, your children who pick up weapons and fight when they should run. He stared directly at Graves. The gods fear you. Graves felt his grip on his rifle tighten. He wanted to dismiss it, call it a trick. But he couldn't ignore the way the war had shifted, the desperation in the celestial attacks. "What do you want?" Graves finally asked. Sol Rath's glowing eyes burned with something new. "To kill a god." Before anyone could respond, an explosion rocked the bunker. The ceiling cracked, dust and debris raining down. A new voice filled the air, deep and suffocating, vibrating in their skulls. "Sol Rath, you betray your own." Outside, descending from the sky like a wrathful deity, stood a true celestial warlord, his golden armor gleaming like a dying sun. The High Sovereign had sent an executioner, and the battle for the first fallen god had begun. The bunker shook as the executioner descended. Golden fire wreathed his towering form, his eyes twin suns burning with righteous fury. Where Sol Rath had been scared and dimmed, this celestial radiated pure, unbroken divinity. His voice echoed through the ruins like the judgment of an angry god. "You would betray the eternal throne for these mortals." Sol Rath stepped forward, unbowed. "I would betray nothing that is worth saving." Then the executioner struck. A shockwave tore through the bunker as divine energy collided with the ruined earth. Walls shattered, debris erupted into the air, and Graves barely had time to throw himself behind cover as the ground heaved beneath them. The force alone sent half his team sprawling. "Move, move." General Holloway's voice crackled through his earpiece, but Graves was already sprinting, dragging a dazed resistance fighter to her feet. Plasma fire erupted all around them, blue and gold streaks colliding in a battle of gods and mortals alike. Sol Rath met the executioner's attack head-on, his own energy flaring to life. The two celestials clashed in a blur of raw power, the very air around them vibrating with the force of their blows. It wasn't just a fight. It was a war in miniature, the rebellion of a fallen god against the relentless wrath of the Sovereign's will. And yet, even as they fought, Graves realized something. Sol Rath was losing. He wasn't as strong as he once was. His defection had cost him, whether through injury, exhaustion, or something deeper. The executioner, unbroken and unwavering, pressed forward, his golden blade cutting through Sol Rath's defenses. Graves gritted his teeth. If Sol Rath fell, they all died. He glanced at Riley, then at the rest of his team. "We take that bastard down," Graves ordered, "or we don't make it out of here." The executioner, sensing their intent, turned his burning gaze upon the humans. "Your defiance is an insult," he thundered. "You stand before gods, and yet you." His words cut off as Graves emptied an entire magazine into his side. The bullets barely staggered the executioner, but they did something more important. They disrupted his focus, and in that instant, Sol Rath struck. With a roar, the fallen warlord drove his fist into the executioner's chest, cracking divine armor. The golden god reeled, his fire faltering for the briefest moment. "Now," Graves shouted. Rockets screamed through the air. Snipers opened fire. Everything humanity had left in that moment was unleashed. And for the first time, a true celestial warlord buckled under mortal fire. Sol Rath did not hesitate. He raised both hands, channeling all that remained of his power, one final, devastating blow. The executioner's form wavered. His golden fire flickered. And then, with a blinding explosion of light, a god fell. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Sol Rath turned to Graves, his voice grim. "This was only the beginning. Now we take the war to the Sovereign." For the first time in history, mortals had slain a god in battle. And now, they were going to storm heaven itself. The corpse of a god smoldered in the ruins. For the first time in recorded history, a celestial warlord had been slain, not by another divine hand, but by the combined defiance of mortals and a fallen god. Word spread across what remained of human communication networks. Resistance cells, scattered and battered, now had proof that the enemy was not invincible. And in the throne room of the High Sovereign, the gods took notice. The Sovereign sat upon a floating dais, his form a swirling mass of radiant energy, his golden eyes narrowing as the news reached him. A god had died at the hands of mortals. Unacceptable. The divine council murmured in uneasy tones, their once unshakable confidence faltering. Nixara, watching from the shadows, saw what the others did not, the first hints of fear. But fear was not enough to stop what was coming. The sovereign rose, his voice shaking the chamber. Enough. We end this. With a wave of his hand, he summoned the final measure. From the depths of the celestial armada, a ship unlike any other emerged. A dreadnought the size of a moon, built not to conquer, but to annihilate. Its name was whispered in reverence across the stars. The Godhammer. Its purpose was simple. Extinction. ###. The final battle begins. On Earth, Daniel Graves stood beside Solrath in an underground resistance war room, watching the tactical display. A red marker, the Godhammer, had appeared at the edge of the solar system, moving fast. Too fast. General Holloway's voice was grim. That thing reaches Earth, we're done. Solrath exhaled. They will not waste time with conversion. They will burn your world and sift the ashes for the survivors they deem worthy. Graves clenched his fists. Then we take the fight to them. The room fell silent. The plan was insane. Earth's fleets were crippled, its armies scattered. The Celestials still outmatched humanity in every way. And yet, hadn't they already done the impossible? Holloway turned to Dr. Carter, the lead scientist in charge of reverse engineering celestial technology. Tell me we have something. Carter's expression was fierce. We do. She pulled up a schematic. The Executioner's core. The celestial warlord they had killed left more than just a body. His very essence had been harvested. With it, Carter had done the unthinkable. We've cracked their energy fields, she said. We can get past their shields. And if we can get a nuke inside their flagship. Solrath's eyes gleamed. It will burn. Graves looked at the map, at the fleet, at the impossibility of what they were about to attempt. Then he smirked. All right, he said. Let's go kill some gods. As the last remnants of humanity's fleet prepared for the impossible, as resistance forces gathered their stolen celestial weapons, and as Solrath prepared to face his former master, the war for heaven began. The stolen celestial warship tore through the void, streaking toward the Godhammer at impossible speeds. Inside the vessel, Daniel Graves tightened his grip on his rifle, staring at the looming behemoth ahead. The Godhammer was less a ship and more a floating apocalypse, a fortress of divine wrath, its hull radiating with the same golden energy that had raised entire cities. It pulsed with power, a living weapon of extinction. If it reached Earth, there would be no war, only fire. General Holloway's voice crackled through the comms. All strike teams. This is it. We breach that ship, plant the payload, and get the hell out. Graves exchanged a glance with Solrath. The fallen Celestial had shed the last remnants of his former station. His once glorious armor was scorched, his glow dimmed, but his eyes burned with something new. Conviction. This will not be an easy fight, Solrath warned. The Sovereign will not let you set foot on that ship unchallenged. Graves smirked. Good. I'd hate for it to be too easy. The breach. As the stolen warship closed in, the Godhammer responded. From its surface, golden spires unfolded like blooming flowers, releasing swarms of celestial enforcers, armored figures wreathed in holy fire, their forms shifting between physical and ethereal. They surged forward, descending upon the approaching vessel like divine retribution. Brace for impact, Holloway shouted. The first wave struck hard. Celestial warriors carved through the hull, their weapons melting steel like butter. Resistance fighters opened fire, bullets and plasma rounds cutting through golden shields. The battle raged inside the ship as Graves and his team pushed toward the boarding pods. Go, 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 Graves barked. Solrath led the charge, his own energy flaring as he clashed with his former brethren. He fought like a man possessed, his strikes no longer elegant, but brutal, driven by something far more human than his kind had ever known. Desperation. The first pod launched, slamming into the Godhammer's hull. The second followed. Graves and his team climbed into the third. Launch now. The world lurched. The pod detached, hurtling toward the enemy ship at breakneck speed. Through the viewport, Graves watched as the battle unfolded in the void. Celestial and human forces locked in chaotic dogfights, debris scattering in all directions. Then, impact. The pod drilled into the Godhammer, cutting through its hull like a spear. The doors blasted open. Graves raised his rifle. Move. Inside the Godhammer. The corridors of the Godhammer pulsed with living light, twisting and shifting as if the ship itself was alive. The moment the strike team entered, the walls screamed. Golden constructs emerged from the walls, humanoid figures made of pure energy, their forms shifting and reforming as they attacked. Resistance fighters fired in all directions, plasma rounds cutting through the divine defenses. "Carter, where's our target?" Graves shouted. Dr. Carter's voice crackled over comms. "Power core is 3 levels down. You'll know it when you see it." "Copy that." Graves turned to Soulwrath. Time to rip out a god's heart. The team pushed forward, deeper into the heart of Heaven's weapon, where the High Sovereign himself was waiting. The heart of the Godhammer was a blinding storm of energy, an enormous sphere of roiling divine fire, suspended in a cathedral of shifting light. It pulsed like a living thing, each surge of golden power strong enough to shatter continents. And standing before it, waiting for them, was the High Sovereign. His form was vast, almost too radiant to look upon. He was no simple warlord, no mere executioner. He was the Celestial, the first, the strongest, the master of all who had conquered before him. "You are insects before a storm," the Sovereign declared, his voice shaking the very walls of the ship. "You scurry and fight, but your kind was never meant to stand against us." Graves leveled his rifle. "Yeah. Then why are we here?" The Sovereign's eyes flared. The air itself twisted as divine power lashed out. Energy so overwhelming that the strike team barely had time to dive for cover before the entire corridor erupted in blinding fire. Soulwrath didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, facing the being he had once worshipped. "You made us into gods," Soulwrath said, voice steady. "And in doing so, you stripped away our will." His hands clenched into fists. "I have seen what we lost, and I reject you." The Sovereign tilted his head. "Then you shall die with them." The battle began. The final stand. The High Sovereign moved like a force of nature. The resistance fighters' weapons barely scratched him. Each bullet, each plasma round simply dissolving against his divine form. Graves barely had time to duck as a wave of golden fire swept through the chamber, vaporizing 2 resistance fighters instantly. "We're not making a dent," Riley shouted. Carter's voice crackled over comms. "The power core. If we overload it." "On it," Graves called back. "Buy me time." He sprinted for the control panel at the base of the energy sphere, dodging bursts of searing light. Behind him, Soulwrath clashed with the Sovereign, each strike of his fists shaking the entire chamber. But the Sovereign was stronger, faster, and with a single devastating blast, Soulwrath was sent crashing into the far wall, his body smoking. Graves reached the console. His hands flew over the alien interface. He didn't understand the symbols, but Carter was in his ear, guiding him. Almost there. The Sovereign turned toward him. "You think destroying this ship will end me?" The god boomed. "I am eternal." "Yeah." Graves slammed his hand on the final command. The core's energy surged wildly, alarms blaring in the ancient celestial tongue. "Then let's see you survive this." The Godhammer began to collapse. The end of a reign. The Sovereign roared, divine energy lashing out in fury. But Soulwrath, broken, wounded, used the last of his strength to seize him. For too long, you have called yourself a god, Soul Wrath whispered, but even gods can fall. With an earth-shaking cry, Soul Wrath dragged the sovereign into the imploding core. Light consumed them both. Graves barely had time to register what had happened before Riley grabbed him, yanking him toward the escape corridor. Move, move, move. The strike team sprinted for the exit pods, diving in just as the Godhammer detonated. The explosion was blinding, a supernova in the black of space, and when the light faded, the celestial armada was silent. Their god was dead. Epilogue. The dawn of humanity. Days later, as humanity rose from the ashes of war, the surviving Celestials did something no one expected. They fled. Without their sovereign, without their absolute ruler, they were nothing more than lost kings without a throne. Some abandoned their posts. Others knelt in surrender. The war was over. Humanity had done the impossible. They had stormed heaven itself, and they had won. As Graves stood on the ruined earth, looking up at a sky no longer filled with enemy warships, he exhaled. The gods thought we were insects, he murmured. Riley smirked beside him. Turns out, insects can bite. And as the first human-built starships took flight, venturing beyond Earth for the first time, not as prey, but as conquerors, one truth became clear. This was no longer the age of gods. This was the age of humanity.